Hello, and welcome to another episode of A Rough Sketch of History. Today's episode is Europe in 1914, or the Tinderbox. In the last episode, we talked about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, the Duchess Sophia. And we're going to see how that event ended up spiraling into the massive war, which was the First World War. So before we get into that, we'll take a look at a map of Europe at that time. Again, my rough sketch map. And I'll kind of go over some of the differences from this map from today and sort of give you a little bit of the lay of the land of the events to come. So a couple of things to notice right off the bat is that Germany is significantly bigger than it is today. It controls a region known as East Prussia at that time, which now is in Poland. Also down here in the south, it controls regions that are Poland, Czechoslovakia, or the Czech and Slovak region. Now they're separate countries. You'll see that up here where Finland would be was part of the Russian Empire. There's no such thing as Ukraine at this time. Romania looks very differently. This is Romania. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, as we covered before, covers a lot of smaller nations. This isn't to scale at all, but Montenegro is an independent nation there. Albania, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, which we call Turkey today, but at the time was the Ottoman Empire. Greece, Italy, France controls North Africa here at this time, what is now independently Algeria, Tunisia. Actually, I believe Tunisia was a separate country, but Algeria was definitely part of France. Ireland is not an independent nation. It is part of the United Kingdom. Nations that I have not colored in are nations that would remain neutral through the war. Oh, we have Belgium here. Spain was neutral, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. Though they were all impacted by the war and involved in one degree or another, they were not direct participants. Now, a couple of key points to explain before we move on to the next visual presentation is that you can kind of get a sense of some of the shared borders here. That Austro-Hungary has a large border with Russia, so does Germany. Today, Germany and Russia do not share a direct border. Today, France controls a region that kind of juts out like a bit of a triangle here, known as the Alsace-Lorraine region. At that time, it was part of Germany. Important thing to know about Germany at this time is that it's a very young country. This is 1914. Germany was not formed until 1871. It was several other countries that joined together, and they fought a war which spilled over with France, known as the Franco-Prussian War. The French lost. Germany was able to unite into a single country, and they had to surrender this region to the Germans. The French had to give it up. And historically, that region between France and Germany is not exactly distinctly French or German. It's kind of its own thing with both French and German aspects to it. But Italy was also a recent country. It had claims to both Austro-Hungarian territory. There was French territory that it believed was still theirs. Both Germany and Italy were kind of new kids on the block, and it's hard to understand. We don't think of Germany as a new nation because in many ways Germans and the German state in one form or another has been around for centuries. But at this point, it really was a big shock to the system. All separated, the German nations were not particularly powerful. But overnight, a very powerful country economically, militarily, culturally, politically, artistically, just poof, appeared. And that was destabilizing to a system that had kind of held uh, Europe in balance for many decades, since the Napoleonic Wars. And things were off balance at that point, and tensions had been on the rise between nations, and we'll kind of cover as to what those tensions were, and to draw what is going to be probably one of the most complex things you're going to see in this series, and still I think one of the reasons why many people find the First World War daunting to study is to exactly how it got started. And it is complicated, but not maybe as not beyond understanding. It just takes a little bit of patience and explaining. So this is my plot map of Europe. We have Germany, Italy, France, Great Britain, Belgium, Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. And in 1914, I think it's fair to say that none of these countries were really looking for a war. Not exactly. Certainly not a war like the First World War. They all had things that they wanted. They all had things that maybe they would be willing to fight about. But wars had been kept relatively small. There had been agreements between nations. I think there is a misconception that the First World War was just this thing that was bound to happen. And in some ways I play into that was that there was the Tinderbox of Europe, as I called the thing that it was on the edge of war. And in a way it was, and in a way it wasn't. And in the way that it wasn't is that no one was overwhelmingly looking for a war. I don't think it was an intentional tinderbox. But it was in a tinderbox in an unintentional way, that things were set up in such a way that I don't think any of the nations realized how close they were to tripping off a much larger conflict than any of them wanted to have. With that said, we'll kind of go through some of the countries and we'll see how this tinderbox, how this tense situation was formed. And we'll go a couple of different categories. We have nations at war, nations that have alliances. Now, alliances at this time, as if with today, are almost exclusively defensive. They usually say, if you are attacked, we will come to your aid. And they have provisions saying that if you attack someone else, that doesn't mean we have to help you. Alliances, are important, but honestly, historically, get broken all the time. So they're not clad in iron. And I have a rather controversial line here we'll put in, wants war. Now, that's hard to say, because within every single one of these nations, there were elements that wanted war and elements that didn't want war. So when I say, for example, that, Germany wanted a war with France or with Russia, that's not to say that the nation was chomping at the bit, but simply that there were elements within the political structure in Germany that saw a war as potentially beneficial. That there was a war that they could win and get something out of it. It doesn't mean they necessarily were gunning for it right at that moment, but it was on their radar. When I say doesn't want war, again, that doesn't mean that there weren't people in those countries that maybe weren't advocating for a stronger stance, but they understood that a war with that country either A, wouldn't get them anything, or B, would be too costly to be worth it. And this one I just did CB to stand for casus belli, which is a Latin term, which essentially means a cause for war, or a reason to go to war. It's a term it's a Latin phrase, it's been in diplomatic speak since the Romans, and that's exactly what it means, is that a nation has a reason to go to war with another nation. And not only that, think of an international community like this, like a playground. It's kind of a childish way to put it, but if you just start wars with other countries, you get viewed as a bully, and it isolates you. People, for lack of a better way to put it, don't want to be your friend. They don't trust you. But if you start wars because you're viewed of, almost, again, in the schoolyard, well, he got hit first, he didn't start it, but he finished it, well, that person doesn't get looked down upon as much. So at this time, and honestly even today, for a country to go to war, they usually want to provide a reason. The reason being, we want your territory, or you have oil or gold or iron mines, which we want and we're going to take them. are not usually considered good reasons, good sufficient for Cassius Belli. So let's see how this web was structured. We start with, I'm going to look at my notes here because this gets unbelievably complicated, as you'll see. But let's start with the alliance structures at the top. So Serbia and Russia had an alliance. A big part of this was that, as I mentioned before, Russia viewed itself as the protector, the guardian over all Slavic nations. They kind of just gave themselves that title. And it's something that even today, to a certain extent, is in Russian culture, that they feel that they have a responsibility towards the other Slavic peoples as the strongest and most populous Slavic nation. So we have an alliance there. Austria-Hungary and Germany had an alliance. They didn't always get along historically, but they were getting along at this time frame. It was mutually beneficial. I don't think either one of them had territory that the other particularly wanted, or at least felt that they could take. And they shared a large border, and it was convenient not to have to worry about them. There were also other benefits from that. Austria-Hungary and Russia were at very tense at this point in time. And Germany served as a counterbalance. They knew that if Russia got hostile with Austria-Hungary, that Austria-Hungary knew that had Germany to defend them. And as I said before in the last episode, Austria-Hungary was a nation with a lot of problems. And a war with Russia was not a problem they needed. And this gave them some security on that front. Now, France and Russia also had an alliance. And this was another newer development, and it helped give security to both of these nations, particularly from Germany. Germany was this new powerful nation that had been formed. They had just a few decades earlier, France and Germany had fought a war where Germany defeated France pretty handily, and Germany, if anything, was more powerful now. And Russia, which we'll talk more about, always had problems throughout the 19th century, and but they could take security in knowing that if Germany moved east to deal with Russia, they would have France on their back door. If they moved west to deal with France, they would have Russia on their front door, back door, other door. So this was a good arrangement for both of these nations, and it really kind of put Germany in a bind, which we'll go more into that later. Germany and Austria-Hungary also had relationships with Italy, and they had alliances. Now, this was kind of an interesting entanglement here. You sort of had the more traditional powers, the more historical powers in Europe, calling a lot of the shots. And Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, for lack of a better way to put it, kind of the cheap seats of Europe at this time. They didn't have the same type of prestige as these other nations, but they wanted that. They wanted a better seat at the table, and they all were kind of, in a sense, upstarts, or even though Austria-Hungary was quite old, nations that were kind of not where they wanted to be, and they sort of bound together to give each other strength to achieve these things, whereas particularly France and Great Britain, to a certain extent Russia, were very much where they wanted to be. They liked the status quo as it was. So maybe that's a better way to put it, as opposed to cheap seats. You have your status quo nations and your not status quo nations, nations that want to change up the status quo because it doesn't benefit them. Now, Great Britain was kind of an interesting case. It wasn't a big fan of alliances on the continent of Europe, though it did have them. It has one with Portugal, which doesn't really play in at this point, and it had one with Belgium. Not so much an alliance, but Belgium was a neutral nation, and Great Britain had vowed to honor the neutrality of Belgium, that Belgium was a small nation, a small army. If bigger nations who just wanted to ignore the fact that they wanted to be neutral, then how could anybody be neutral? So they had an agreement with them that they would they would defend their neutrality. So this is kind of the basic alliance structure, sort of the reasons for it. Again, going back to Great Britain, very much a status quo nation. Great Britain was the financial center of the world. It was an extremely wealthy nation. It controlled international shipping through insurance policies. At that time, the New York Stock Exchange, though a big deal, was not as a big deal. The financial center of the world was London. And Great Britain was perfectly fine with that. So they weren't interested in all of this sort of nonsense in Europe on the continent that might upset the apple cart. When they got involved, it was usually to try to, whoever was trying to change things, to stop them from doing it. So again, that put the tension with Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and they got along better with France and Russia because, again, these countries weren't as eager to have major upsets. Now, one country I didn't mention here is the Ottoman Empire, what would later become Turkey. Kind of an interesting point. The Ottoman Empire did have a European presence, though most of its population and power was in the Middle East. But it was considered, for all intents and purposes, a European nation at that time. And even today, that's something gets discussed about, is Turkey, how integrated should it be with the European Union? Is it a European nation? Is it a Middle Eastern nation? Anyway, that's a whole other topic. But they had been called, this was a term that was used at the time, and the sick man of Europe, that they had a lot of problems. The country was losing territory left and right. They were becoming increasingly unstable. And they were desperate to change that course. They needed military assistance to modernize their military. They needed economic assistance to industrialize their countries, to switch from a more old system of agricultural economy to an industrial economy. So they were desperately trying to form alliances, and we'll kind of just put in a tentative thing here, that they were both looking at Germany and Great Britain. There were factions within the Ottoman Empire that liked moving towards Germany. Germany was a rising power. It had a massive industrial base, a massive army, and it wasn't so interested in clamping down on the status quo, which the status quo was the Ottoman Empire being a weak and chaotic nation. Great Britain, on the other hand, was even richer than Germany. It didn't have a powerful army, but it had a massive navy. It controlled shipping. It controlled trade all over the globe. Both of these would have been good friends to have for the Ottoman Empire. And prior to the war, there was a little bit of both these. There was some diplomatic back and forth. I think Germany tried a little harder. I think Great Britain was a little bit more take it or leave it. But again, the alliance structure. Now let's look at wanting war. So let's make sure I have the right color here. Yeah. Now, like I said, I had to put a big caveat on this. This is not meaning that these countries were chomping at the bit to start wars, but that they had something to gain that I felt the war could potentially give them. Now, Austria-Hungary wouldn't have minded a war that much with Serbia. Serbia was a relatively new country in the Balkans, and the Ottoman Empire, which had pulled back, kind of left a power vacuum. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire was very interested in sort of being the boss in that region. Serbia wasn't too keen on anybody being its boss. And as we talked about before, there was Austro-Hungarian territory that they wanted, but Austria-Hungary was much too powerful of a nation for Serbia to fight a war with, so they did not want a war. But the Austro-Hungarians, as I said, could have seen this as an advantage for them. Problem is that a war with Serbia would mean a war with Russia, and they most certainly did not want a war with Russia. Russia was massively more powerful militarily than they were, though the economy was more developed in Austria-Hungary, not by a lot so, or at least, but it was more centralized. The Austrian region was quite developed. The rest of the country was quite poor. Russia, on the other hand, was not very well developed in 1914 at all, industrially or technologically, but it was big. And there were lots of Russians, and there was lots of land and resources to be had, and Russia was growing more powerful every decade. So, but here we have a connection between Germany, and we'll see how this plays out in the future, is that Austria-Hungary thinks that maybe a war with Serbia wouldn't be so bad if Germany could take care of Russia, keep Russia occupied for them. And there were aspects in Germany that wouldn't have minded a war with Russia. Russia and Germany shared a border. Germany had just formed as a country. They had fought a very successful war a few decades earlier with France and gained some territory. And most of the borders that Germany shared with Russia was not Russian per se. It would have been Polish, it would have been Ukrainian, it would have been Lithuanian, Latvian, not necessarily Russian in ethnicity. So, as an empire, Germany could just say, well, we're going to take charge of these areas now. Now, what Germany didn't want with Russia is that, as I said before, every decade Russia was getting more and more modern. Its military was getting more modern. Its economy was getting more modern. And Germany was terrified of Russia eventually catching up and swamping Germany. So there were people who thought, well, if we can have a war with Russia now, when it's less developed and weaker, and maybe get some territory to be a buffer region, to maybe get some have them acquiesce some funds, or set up a treaty making them not permitted to put fortifications on the border, something that would give us an edge in the future. So they saw that as an advantage. So we'll see as this grows out. So Austria-Hungary is hoping that Germany would help them against Russia because they had a reason. But then that would bring in France. Now, France had a reason to want to have a war with Germany. As I said earlier, they had fought a war a few decades before, and they had lost territory. There was a movement, debatable to how influential it was, but there were people in France that felt like that French territory, that the honor of France needed to be restored, and that a second war with Germany would set things right. They'd get their territory back. Germany would, of course, stay a formed nation. That they had won that part of the war. I don't think anybody in France felt that Germany shouldn't exist anymore. But they wanted that territory back, and they kind of wanted their reputation to be resolved. Now, Germany did not want a war with France, mostly because they had everything they wanted from France. France was a very powerful military nation at that time, and a war with France would be destructive, and to what end? So they didn't want one with France. And Great Britain and Germany had an interesting relationship too. Germany did not want a war with Great Britain at this time. Germany was quite frustrated with Great Britain. Great Britain had all these colonies all over the world. Germany was late to the colonial game. They didn't really have much, or at least they didn't have the prime pickings of colonies that France and Great Britain got to have as unified nation during the colonialization period. Great Britain had a massive navy, so it was always hemming Germany in anywhere in the world it wanted to get involved. But kind of reminiscent to how Germany and Russia had a conflict where Germany thought a preemptive conflict with Russia would be beneficial. There were people in Great Britain that felt like that the rising power of Germany was dangerous. Germany was on a massive shipbuilding kick. Their navy was getting expanded more and more, and though it couldn't compete with in 1914 with Great Britain's navy, it was getting close. And at this point, Germany was a greater industrial power than Great Britain. So there were some people who felt that a smaller war with Germany now, to make them maybe sign a treaty saying you can only build so many ships, or maybe just a small conflict where they could sink a whole bunch of German ships and sort of spook them and hope that they wouldn't, well, in the future, try to pick a fight. So there was an aspect of Great Britain that there was anti-German sentiment and a thought that there was a inevitable conflict. In fact, for those of you who grew up in the 1980s or were alive in that period, there was a lot of movies coming out about the Soviet Union attacking the United States or invading the United States. And in Great Britain at this time, there was actually a series known as invasion literature. There was novels and short stories published in magazines about a German invasion of Great Britain. It was seemed that at some point it was going to happen. How seriously most people took it, it's hard to say, but at least it was out there. So, as you notice, Italy kind of is off on its own. Now, Italy has its issues with France, that's for sure, but it also has some issues with its ally, Austria-Hungary. So in some ways we can kind of put a tentative wanting in with either one. They both had territory which the Italians wouldn't have minded having, but I don't think the Italians, they understood they were not really in a position to take on either one of these countries. And they had this nice alliance system that was keeping them safe, and I don't think they were really looking to get involved in a major war. And honestly, as I said, I don't think any of these countries were really looking for a war when 1914 happens and the Archduke is assassinated. But now let's look at how that tips things off, and this is where the origin of the war really comes into being. There was a period known as the July Crisis. Now, it's interesting to note that the assassination happened in June, and things actually kind of quieted down a little bit afterwards. There was an initial outcry, the world was shocked, and like a lot of tragedies that happen on the news today, within a week, people had kind of moved on. But Austria-Hungary saw an opportunity. It had a casus belli against Serbia. It had become quite clear that Serbia, either directly or indirectly, was involved in the assassination. And Austria-Hungary had kind of been the bully of the Balkans for a long time. And for the first time, they actually had something that they weren't the bad guy. And they saw an advantage here. So what they did is they issued an ultimatum to Serbia. And I think this is just an interesting side note to kind of tell you what the world was like at this time. So German-speaking Austria-Hungary sends a ultimatum to Serbo-Croatian speaking Serbia, and it's written in French, because French is what all diplomatic things are written in at that time. So anyway, interesting to me. So Austria-Hungary sends them an ultimatum. Essentially what they wanted was they just wanted a lot of concessions to kind of keep Serbia under their thumb. But also they wanted Serbia to stop meddling around with the Serbian population in Austria-Hungary, which, isn't really all that unreasonable. So they kind of had reasonable and unreasonable demands. But the list was put together in such a way to essentially force Serbia to say no. They didn't want the Serbians to say no or to say yes to it. And they gave them a 48-hour deadline. This is in late August. And the reason they gave them a 48-hour deadline is because in the past, anytime an international event had happened, all of these countries got together, they sent their diplomats. There were times where war got close before, but they talked it out, there was time, and it got settled. The Austrians didn't want this to get settled. What they wanted was, they wanted Serbia to come back and say no, and then Austria-Hungary would declare war on Serbia. And they thought they had an advantage here. Serbia had misbehaved in this case. Russia had all sorts of revolutionary problems. They had had a big revolution in 1906, not even 10 years ago. There was a lot of nervousness that the monarchy was under threat in Russia, and they thought, well, there's no way on earth that the Russians are going to go to the defense of a country who is sponsoring radicals to shoot monarchs. That's not going to happen. So they thought Russia's probably not going to get involved. But just to be safe, let's check with Germany and say, if the Russians get involved, will you view that as a protection? Will that hold up as a defensive part of our alliance, that Russia is attacking us unprovoked? And Germany said, through its diplomatic directions, that yes. Now this is an interesting thing of how miscommunication led to the war. Germany essentially said, you've got a term is often used in historical terms. I don't know exactly where this came from, but a blank check. That you have a blank check to do what you will with Serbia, and we will stand by you. Now, when the Germans were meeting with the Austro-Hungarians, they seemed to think that the Austro-Hungarians were going to send a small expeditionary force into Serbia, maybe occupy a few places along the border, prove their point, walk home. And then that way Serbia was humiliated. Austria-Hungary gains prestige in the eyes of Europe. They can maybe use that as a diplomatic lever to get Serbia to agree to the things that they had demanded in their ultimatum. And the Serbs eventually do respond to the ultimatum. They deny it. They actually accept all of the points, which were all quite humiliating, except one thing they did not accept, and I think you'll understand why when I tell you. They did not accept that one of the criteria was that law enforcement officials from Austria-Hungary would be allowed to enter into Serbia to question, to interrogate, to arrest, and remove any Serbian citizen anywhere in Serbia. So you can imagine if, for example, Mexico petitioned the United States and said, we want the authority to send our police into your country and arrest your citizens without your say-so. There's not a nation on earth that would agree to such a task, because at that point they really wouldn't be an independent nation anymore. Well, Austria took this for what they wanted, and they declared war on Serbia, and they invaded. And at this point, Russia has a casus belli to defend their ally in Serbia. Now, as I said, it wasn't entirely sure that the Russians would intervene. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire sent a very large army, much larger than I think the Germans were anticipating, into Serbia, and the fighting was intense. And at this point, Russia started to partially mobilize. It becomes kind of a nicety of phrases, but they started to partially mobilize their army. Now, at this time, most countries like Russia, or most of Europe for that matter, didn't have huge standing armies. They had sizable armies, but most of their people were reserves. The reserves, there was a core army that was ready to go, but most of the people were reserves. You'd get a notice that, a telegram would be sent to, the town square or whatever. It would be announced that people needed to show up at the muster points. They would, you'd have to put notice into your work. You go to your local base, you get your weapons, your uniform. It could often take days or even weeks, and in a country like Russia that was very underdeveloped, Austria-Hungary, and to a certain extent Germany, believed that, by the time Russia actually gets its army set to the border, the war in Serbia will be over, and there'll be nothing for them to, Serbia will have surrendered, that they will have no justification to go to war, and at that point they would be facing both the Austro-Hungarian army and the German army. And this is where a twist of fate sets in that starts to set things in a direction I don't think anyone expected. I think what was going on at this point could have been contained. There were wars in Europe. There would have been a clash between Austro-Hungary and Serbia. The war could have ended, and it would have just been a footnote. It would have been known as the Third Balkan War, which tells you that in the early 20th century, there was the First Balkan War, the Second Balkan War. Another war in the Balkans wouldn't have shocked anybody. But Germany gets quite nervous about this because Russia starts mobilizing at a rate much faster than anyone expected and much larger. Germany began to perceive that the army that Russia was raising was not just an army to deal with Austria-Hungary, but also to deal with Germany. And Germany had, I don't know if you want to call it a complex, but I would call it a complex, but they referred to it as encirclement. It was in their papers all the time. It was kind of a catchphrase of the day, that they felt that France, Great Britain, Russia were all kind of ganged up on them, and that they were, surrounded on all sides by enemies. And they thought, well, if Russia invades us, then certainly France will get involved as well, and we will lose. We cannot fight both these countries at the same time. Clearly, it is Russia's intent to expand this war. So they viewed this mobilization as a casus belli towards Russia. So they begin to mobilize their forces, which makes Russia nervous, which both expands and increases the rate of their mobilization. Meanwhile, there still is fighting going on between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Now, Russia is nervous. Now, Germany had a plan, and if you know anything about World War I history, you've probably heard this term, the Schlieffen Plan. And it was a battle plan, I guess, or a strategy that they had in case there was a war. This is how they would win it, because they figured that they were going to have to fight France and Russia. So the idea was that Russia was this big backwards nation that was actually the real threat because it was huge, but it would take weeks, maybe even a month to 2 months for it to get its army together. France was a smaller nation with an advanced telegraph, telephone, railroad system. France would be on the doorstep of Germany in a matter of days or hours. And the border between France and Germany was very well defended. So Germany has the idea of invading Belgium, going through Belgium into France, fighting a war very similar to the war they had fought with France in the Franco-Prussian War, where they would quickly surround and destroy the French army. The French would quickly capitulate. Then the entire German army would pack up on trains, go to the other side of the country just in time for the Russians to come charging in, and they would fight Russia, defeat them on their own terms, and then Germany would enter into a new glorious age where both their rivals, France and Russia, had been subdued. Now, I could go into it in length. There are a lot of problems with that plan, but that was the plan that they had. But here's where things get kind of dicey. The government of Germany was a monarchy, but the monarch, the king, only had so much power, and there were lots of different factions and groups at play. He wasn't an absolute dictator who could just say, this is what's going to happen, it's going to happen. So when Germany starts preparing for a war, all of the trains start moving, the German soldiers, to the Belgian-French border, which the Kaiser, the king or the ruler or emperor of Germany, questions his commanders about this. Well, we're worried about Russia. Why are we going to France? And they said, well, this is the plan. This is how it's going to happen. If we fight Russia, we'll have to fight France. And this was a failing on many levels. Had Germany tried diplomacy more, had they not assumed that things would have played out this way, things could have been very different. I think the Kaiser had his doubts, but his generals convinced him that this was the only way to possibly proceed with the war, and they were quite confident that they would win it. Though he did ask them if it was possible to switch this around. Could we, instead of moving all the troops west, could we move them east? And his generals told him no, that this was planned down to the train car, to the minute. It would be chaos, and it probably would have been chaos. But whether or not having a war is worth messing up a train schedule is debatable. But part of this plan, for this Schlieffen Plan to work, was that it moved quickly and that they get the upper hand. So Germany did what nobody was, I think, really expecting too much. In fact, I think there was a certain sense that things were calming down. The Russians hadn't invaded Austria-Hungary. There was time, but unexpectedly, Germany declares war on Russia. And this sets a chain of things in motion, because then almost immediately they move to declare war on France, and they do so by moving into Belgium. First, they just moved their soldiers into Belgium. They asked for permission. Belgium said no, so they moved their soldiers in, declared war. and through Belgium, Germany was going to be at war with France. The French were somewhat preparing for this, that there were tensions, and they knew that if there was a war with Russia, there would be a war with them. So they start to prepare and get ready for their war. And as I said before, there were, even though the French felt like they didn't start this war, but they certainly had something to gain from it. And they had been planning and talking. The plans for a war against Germany were not foreign to the high command of the French army. This had been what they had prepared for, or what they'd been preparing for. The Germans were quite confident that the British would stay out of this. Yes, they had this treaty with Belgium, but who's going to go to war over Belgium? Belgium's a small country. In the realms of royalty, the King of Belgium did not have a very good reputation. He was known, Belgium was often looked down by other European countries for its terrible treatment of its subjects in the Belgian Congo and their colonies. And in 1914, if the other European countries feel that you're treating your colonial citizens poorly, then you're treating them very poorly. But Great Britain did actually honor this alliance, and they declared war on Germany. Again, I think their reasons were that they wanted to defend Belgian neutrality. I think that there was a sense that France was also an ally, at least a nominal ally. They had similar goals. They had good relations. And I think there was a fear, as I said, that Germany was sort of this power on the rise that was going to be uncontrollable. So Germany and Austria-Hungary appeal to their ally Italy, Italy decides that, no, you started this war and we're going to sit this out, and kind of put feelers out to France and Austria-Hungary that, well, maybe we could be enticed to get involved, but, what's in it for us? But at least in the opening stages of the war, Italy's going to sit it out. Now, here we have this system, and the war is getting started in earnest now. Austria-Hungary and Russia start fighting. They're still fighting in Serbia. There's fighting against Russia and Germany. There's fighting in Belgium. It spills over into France. Great Britain sends troops into France and Belgium. The war starts to get big and fast. And the first month of the war, which again could have a whole series on its own, was catastrophic beyond any war that had been fought in Europe since the Napoleonic period. It was something that was shocking. The European nations were not ready for it, and they all got desperate to try to bring on additional allies to their side. Great Britain and France desperately tried to pressure the Ottoman Empire to stay out of the war, but an interesting side story of what ends up happening is that two German naval cruisers are stuck in the Mediterranean Ocean when the war starts. And it is, when I say stuck, it is true. None of these countries were really thought this much ahead about it. They all had ships in each other's harbors. People traveling on vacation were caught. This was not, it literally went from within a week, all the crisis is averting, the clouds are parting from the Archduke, being assassinated, things are going back to normal, to we're on a full-on continental war. It literally was that quick. And it all did stem from the fact that, honestly, I think Germany misread diplomatic cues from around it and felt that the offensive was the only way that they could do it. They were essentially preemptively fighting, which led to a very interesting thing, because if you went to any of these nations, let me finish the story before I get back to that. So, two ships stuck in the Mediterranean. They end up fleeing to the Ottoman Empire as a neutral nation. Now, Great Britain had been making two battleships for the Ottoman Empire to sell to them. the Lord of the Admiralty, someone who you may have heard of before, Winston Churchill, decides the Ottomans might not be our friends in this conflict. They might side with Germany. So thank you, Ottoman Empire, for giving us money for these ships, but we're going to keep them, and if they survive the war, you can have them then. These were expensive. It was humiliating to the Ottoman Empire, and here Germany shows up with 2 ships, and which they can't possibly get back to Germany. So they say, well, here you go. You can have these ships. We're going to give them to you as a gift from the German people. And this was enough to shift the perception in the Ottoman Empire. Early in the war, Germany was doing very well, so they signed a secret alliance between the Ottoman Empire and Germany, which months later would come into it. Germany and Russia, or Ottoman Empire and Russia, had long-standing feuds, and the Ottoman Empire would declare war on Russia, which eventually would bring the French and the British into war with the Ottoman Empire. So you see, it's simple. It really isn't that complicated at all how the war started. No, I mean, it is quite complicated. And so this is how the war started. But an important thing, as I was saying before, to realize is that the way the war was structured, the way that it began, every country viewed themselves as the victim, which is kind of a strange, and legitimately so, not sort of a propaganda. I mean, in World War II, the Germans made up this story that Poland had attacked them. It didn't make any sense. But Germany felt like Russia was getting ready to invade them. What were they to do? Wait for the Russians to come? Austria-Hungary, was reacting to a terrorist attack. The Ottoman Empire, their property had been seized by Great Britain. Their honor as a nation had been sullied. Russia viewed them as defending fellow Slavs, and Germany and Austria-Hungary declared war on Russia first, even though they viewed Russia as the aggressor. They were the ones that actually followed the war first. France felt like it was sitting in, minding its own business when it got invaded, so Germany could beat Russia, and that was confusing to them. They felt like they were being attacked for essentially no reason, or no valid reason other than Germans were aggressive. Great Britain saw a Germany that was on the march and felt like that it had to defend peace and prosperity in Europe. Every country viewed itself as a victim. And I think that was one of the reasons that the war lurched into existence so quickly, and there was such a huge patriotic fervor in all of the countries of people signing up in the hundreds of thousands. They didn't bat an eye when conscription was put into place, because every nation was viewed as, we were attacked, we had to defend ourselves. We have kind of a similar experience in the United States with how the country reacted after Pearl Harbor in World War II. There was this sense that all of the previous struggles and arguments and divisions in the nation needed to be put aside because we had been attacked by an outside force and we needed to band together. And this was a war, which I said, everybody had their own little reasons, for wanting the war. And as the war trudges on, it goes from weeks to months to years, the sacrifice gets higher and higher. And the more and more these war wants, these reasons for why the war had to be fulfilled, because it gets harder to end the war as the war progresses, because are you going to end the war with everything as it was? How do you explain that to your people? What did we do? Why didn't we punish this other nation? Or why didn't we get something out of it? So with that said, we have the opening of the war. The next video will cover, again, the impossibly large task of from 1914 all the way up to almost the very end of the war when the Meuse-Argonne offense starts. So I'll kind of give you a real quick rundown of all of the history of the war, from this initial outbreak of the war to the last days of the war. So thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this.